Hey guys, it's Multiplier. We're with Sonic Academy today having a look at the next video in our series on how to make twerk. So in the previous video, we set up a drum rack and we made an 808 kick. In this video, we're going to fill out some more of those drum rack slots and do the basic MIDI for the drum patterns. We'll do some drum fills and some variations later on, but in this video, we're going to get the drums in and we're going to just get the basics of those patterns written out. So first things first, let's have a look at what I call a clair, so a clappy snare. And to do that, let's simply find it in our sample pack area or the samples for the project. So current project samples, and the snare in question will be this one, I think. So it's definitely a snare, but it's quite a clappy, aggressive sort of snare. We do need to ease off on the top end of that, which we'll sort out with EQ and stuff later on. But for now, let's drag it out into the empty drum rack slot, which is right next to the kick. And let's name this clair, because it's going to be like a clap snare while we're at it. So right click, rename, clair. And then what we're going to do is we're going to layer up another percussive sound behind this. So we're going to group this simpler instrument, because this is basically a simpler instrument, into an instrument rack, similar to what we did with the kick in the previous video. So right click, group. And then this puts it in an instrument rack. We can then use this little button here to open up the instrument rack, all the different layers. Let's name this clap or snare while we're here. So let me just say clap. And then let's find the supplementary layer for this particular sound, which let's see if I can find out or remember which one it is. So I think it's this one. Perfect. So we'll drag that out into drop an instrument or sample here. So we've got two layers in parallel. We'll rename this so we don't get too confused. We'll say percussion 1, why not? And so while we're here, in fact, let's get rid of the velocity sensitivity for this particular drum rack slot. So for clap, we'll go to velocity sensitivity slider, drag that to 0. That way, it doesn't matter how hard I trigger the note on or in my case, an Ableton push, but in your case, maybe a keyboard. And then percussion 1, similarly, we'll get rid of the velocity sensitivity. So we'll just drag that down to 0. And now, whenever I trigger it, it doesn't matter how hard I press the note. And we'll just do one tiny bit of balancing. So we'll bring down the volume of this percussive layer very slightly. And that is our clair or our clappy snare. Or in fact, let's actually add in a little bit of room reverb to the percussive sound here to give it a bit more space. So we'll go over to audio effects. We'll find a cool reverb. I think the one we need to use is called guitar room. And we'll drag that purely behind percussion or this percussive sound and not the clap, since we don't need it on the whole thing. We'll drag it out. And make sure it's not behind the whole instrument rack, but purely behind this percussive layer. And then ease back on the dry wet until it's an appropriate level. Hear that space if I turn it off and on? So that clap or that clappy snare, which is the first layer we put in, gives it a bit more punch, and then this percussive layer gives it a bit more character and puts it in a space with that small room reverb, fills up the stereo image and just makes it a bit more interesting. Next, we're going to put in an open hat or an open hi-hat, call it what you like. It's this sort of sound. I find the one that we're going to use. I think it's this one. Yeah, that's it. So it's an open hi-hat, somewhat noisy. Let's drag it into an empty slot and give it a name. Open hat. And let's also get rid of the velocity sensitivity. So just like before, we'll pull down the velocity slider here. So now we've got a few drums into our drum rack. We're going to add a few more in soon. Let's focus in on getting the main drum pattern going for our track, which will be the main drum pattern for the drop section. So what we'll do, we will find the A section up here and just choose 4 bars of it. So we'll select a region and right click, insert a MIDI clip. And let's give it a color while we're here. And now we have our MIDI clip. What we can do is go in and draw in the MIDI notes we like, just because, at least me personally, I'm not very good at finger drumming in an actual drum pattern. I prefer to draw it in manually and then make any edits or adjustments I need to afterwards. So there's a few ways we can draw in our MIDI notes. The way I prefer to do it myself is to learn the shortcut B. That hops into pencil mode. You can also hit pencil mode option right up near the top right, but it's definitely worth learning the shortcut B because it's so fast and you use it so much. And then I can just draw in the actual pattern that I want. Cool, so we've got a 2-bar pattern in there. In fact, let's just loop that for 2 bars. So we'll hop out of pencil mode by hitting B. We'll go down to where it says length down here, which is the length of the looped section for this particular MIDI clip. And then we'll just type in 2 and that will loop through that basically 2-bar section. You can also see the loop brace change this thing at the top. And there you go, that'll be our main drum pattern. That'll be the backbone structurally and rhythmically for our whole track. So now we've got that, let's create a variation on that for the second 4-bar half of a 8-bar section. So what we'll do is we'll grab this green clip here, which is 4 bars long, looped twice, or it's a 2-bar long loop that's looped twice for 4 bars. We will duplicate it, so it's worth learning the shortcut again for this, Command D. And then we'll color it something else so we don't get confused. I'm a big fan of color coding things, so when you have the whole track minimize, I'll show you in a sec. So let's give it a color quickly. Let's color it. So I've given it a color. The nice thing about the colors is if you make a change to this, we make a variation. So if we close this down, we can still see at a glance that there's one idea for 4 bars and then a second idea 4 bars after that. You still have to somewhat remember what, say, the green is versus the blue, but it just helps keep track of what's going on, which is super important if you want a clean mix and you don't want to get completely lost in your track. So let's draw in this variation on the drum loop for this blue section. What we're in fact going to do is leave the kick and the clap snare alone and just insert some open hi-hats. And we're in fact going to hop into triplet grid mode for this. So we want to insert some triplets. So to do that, we right click and go into triplet grid. You can learn the shortcut for this, but you don't do it too often. Triplet grid. And then let's draw in some appropriate triplets. So I think by drawing in a note there, and then doing shift right, that makes it slightly longer. And then doing Command D to duplicate this through. And again, shift right, and then duplicate. Again, it's worth learning these shortcuts. And now I say it a lot just because it saves so much time when you're being creative. You can just get the ideas down and you're not spending ages just doing loads of clicking. Cool stuff. Let's see what this sounds like. Sounding nice and twerky, nice and trappy. I like it. And this is probably a good time to insert some reverse snares or some reverse sweeps, which will give it a bit of extra something else. So let's do that now. So we'll open up a brand new audio track. We're in fact going to do this bit in audio. So the shortcut Command T inserts a new audio track. And then we'll zoom in to focus in on what's happening. And we'll find this short up, which is a reverse sweepy thing. Drag it out. And whenever you drag out an audio clip, the first thing to do every time is have a look to see, is it being warped? If so, what are the warp settings? So if we solo this channel, maybe turn down the volume just a little bit for now, and then have a look at the warp settings. So it is warped. It's warped to exactly 1 bar long, and it's on repitch mode. Let's just see what it sounds like. So it sounds quite low in pitch. Let's duplicate this, well, not duplicate it. Let's change the length by a factor of 2 a few times to make it a bit shorter. So let's try this one, is it? Yeah, so this button here. One of these 2 makes it twice as long. One makes it twice as short. I just try each one until it does what I expect it to do. getting better. Let's try one more time. So it's super short. There you go, nice and pitched. It's been basically pitched up because of the re-pitch warp mode. It's not doing any processing, so when we make the clip shorter in time, it'll pitch it up, but it'll sound super clean. Sounds really nice, I like it. And then it's just a case of chopping the bits off we don't need. So let's chop all of this off. And now we have our nice short thing. And if we put this in front of this snare here, I'll call it a snare or clare or clap, depending on what mood I'm in, but it's basically the same thing as that snare or that clap on the second beat. So I've got it in place right before the second beat. I think it'd be cool if it's not before the fourth beat, because it would be the natural thing to do would be to duplicate it like this. So it's before each clap or each snare. But let's in fact only have it once. I think that'd be good. Gives a cool effect. And then let's duplicate this out for our whole section. And then we need to dial in the actual volume of this thing. We don't want it to be too overpowering, too dominating. Just give a bit of something else to the rhythm and the feel. So dial in the track fader position here. Still too high. I really like that. Let's listen again. See how it's quite subtle? You're not consciously hearing it as, oh, there's a reverse sweep happening right now. Just gives a bit of something else to the drum loop, which pulls you into it. But then because it's not for the second bit, it just keeps it interesting without just being too simple and too obvious. It's quite hard to explain, but definitely subtlety is the key to this, and I think it sounds great. And let's name this channel while we remember. Let's call it pre-snare. So now we have our drum loop going. Let's now do some drums for the intro. So for the intro, we need a very classic, very typical clap sound, like a normal, just a solid clap. It's super common in Twerk to have this, so we need to definitely have it for the intro, pretty much as a way of saying, right, this is a Twerk track coming up. So let's go into the main drums and add in that clap sound into a new drum rack slot. So we'll find the clap, which is this one here. Super solid, don't need any more layering. It's just a nice, chunky, amazing clap. We'll drag that out into the empty slot, E1, and we'll give it a name. We'll rename it intro clap. And as before, let's get rid of the velocity sensitivity. So it's okay, but it needs a bit of something else. I think it needs a bit of delay and a bit of reverb just to fill it out and just fill out the stereo image, make it a bit more interesting and put it in a real space. So for the delay, to give it a bit of something else, let's go to audio effects and simple delay and drag that in behind it. And then because we're going to be playing these at eighths divisions, we only have one option really in terms of the delay length, and that'll be a 16th. So I split in the eighth in half. So we'll do delay time 1, because remember this number here is the number of 16ths for the delay time. And let's pull back on the dry wet so it's super subtle. Right down there. So you can hear it now. When it's right down, you can barely hear it. It's almost like an extra echo for the clap, so it's giving it that little bit of something else. And then just because we can, let's actually move this delay time slightly off where it should do. So right now it's happening right on the 16th. If we change this percentage slider for the left and the right separately, very slightly, it'll move it off the grid, away from where it should do, give it a slightly swung feel. So we'll move this up to a few percent or so. Again, super subtle, but sometimes the subtlety is quite nice and is quite necessary. So the delay is actually blending in with the whole sound, almost like an extension of the clap. But let's now put it in a reverb. This one you'll hear a lot more obviously, and this one is designed to be heard a lot more obviously. So let's find the reverb we want, which would be wooden room. Drag it out, and then adjust the dry wet to taste. And that's about right. definitely quite obvious, but that's part of the Twerk sound, is this 8th clap with quite a reverby effect on there. In a moment, we'll balance all the level of these drums. We haven't mixed the actual volume of each of these drums relative to each other too much yet. Yes, we did for the pre-snare, but not for this drum rack. We'll do that in a moment. But now what we're going to do is actually do the MIDI for the intro, so all the drum programming for the intro, which is a little bit more complicated in terms of what's going on than for the drop section. So we'll draw out a long MIDI clip, right-click, insert MIDI clip, and give it a color. So for the drum programming, let's hop into the MIDI editor bit and start drawing things in. So first of all, we want to draw in 8ths for the intro claps. So we go to the 8th division, and then we'll just draw these in by clicking and dragging. And we probably want 8 bars of this, because the first bit's going to be mostly intro, and then the second 8 bars is going to be more of a build. So that's why I called it intro build. And then we'll hop back into 16ths for the grid. So right click 16ths, and we'll start drawing in everything else we need. So I think we want open hats on 16ths there. And then quarter hats like that. And then 8ths for the next bit. Jumping into 16th slightly early to make it nice and interesting for there. But maybe we want it to the last beat like that. And some claps in here as well, or some snares, or a clap. Draw some in. In fact, let's do some duplication here. So we'll select a region, and then Command D, Command Z to undo. It's worth learning that one as well. Saves you loads of time. And then we also want some kicks in here. So we want one there, and one there, and then one there, and one there. And that should be our intro drum MIDI. Let's listen to it through to make sure it sounds about right for an intro and a build. Remember, it's going to be an intro and then a build. So what's going to happen is around the 9th bar, we're going to then have more stuff turning it into a nice build to get you nice and excited. In fact, we need one more little detail in there. So on the final beat right before the drop, so there's one beat before the drop actually happens, we want that open hat to play just to give it a bit of extra energy for that pre-drop thing. I'm going to focus in on that more in a later video, but let's for now just draw that in. So B, and we'll draw that in. So we have that open hat hitting for that final beat right before the whole thing drops into the main bit of the track. And then what we also need to do is move these pre-snares into a bit of this, well, for the build section, basically. So the snares sound a bit better. So we'll copy that across with Command C, paste with Command V. So now these snares will sound a bit better, and then we'll also keep them running through to the actual drop. And in terms of, well, how do we know to do that as our MIDI for our drums? It's a little bit of trial and error, but it's also, I mean, there is some theory behind it. So, for example, those intro claps being on the 8th divisions, that's just something you do in Twerk. It's one of the most common things that makes a track twerk beyond the BPM and the 808s. These claps are probably the next in line in terms of the things that would make a track, quote unquote, a twerk track. So we have those intro claps doing their thing, then they disappear for the build section, so it gives the track somewhere to go. So the claps happen, keeps the BPM nice and fast, and then especially with those 16th open hats coming in, it's quite a fast feel to it, but then it slows down a bit at the start of the 9th bar. Notice how now these open hats that were at a 16th division are now at a quarter division. So energy's nice and high when you start the track, and then it slows itself down, which is an important part of the build process. You can only build people up if you take them down to begin with. So we've essentially slowed down the energy, brought down the energy a bit, so we can then build them back up with the classic repeating drum patterns. So where every logical division, you halve the length of time for the division. So after 4 bars, we jump into 8ths, and then after 2 more bars, we jump into 16ths. Granted, we did it slightly early, intentionally, just to make it a little bit more interesting. It's almost like we have a fill, and then it jumps into 16th divisions. That was why we did those drums like that. And then also a key part of this is we wanted the kicks in there somewhere in the first 8 bars, because before we inserted those kicks, granted we didn't want a full-fledged kick pattern, we didn't want to fill up the low end and use up all the kick energy before we'd even got to the drop, but I felt like we needed just a few kicks in there to allude to the actual drop section, let everyone know we do have some 808s coming, and also just have something happening in the low end. It doesn't have to be this big exciting low end, just a bit of something to tease the listener and just fill up that low end temporarily until the build happens with some big boomy effects, and then when the drop happens and it opens up fully and you have those 808s doing their thing. So that was why we did the drum MIDI like that, but it definitely was a bit of trial and error to get the subtle details in there, and that's basically why we did the drum MIDI like that in terms of conceptual songwriting ideas and stuff. And now we have that in there, let's in fact take everything we've written here and extend it out throughout the arrangement. So for these pre-snares, we're just going to duplicate them throughout the entire thing. So Command D, and then we'll zoom in to make sure they've duplicated properly. Yep, so everything's on the grid as it should be. Zoom back out, and then if we duplicate all this through lots of times, I think the only change we'll make is for the second A bar section, we won't have the blue bit, we'll just have the green extended. And similarly for the outro. Cool stuff. So now we have that all laid out. Let's do that final little thing we said we were going to do, and that is balance the levels of each of those drums. So we'll start at the intro and then just go through and do some tweaks. Quite nice. Let's double check everything relative to those intro claps again, so we'll just play through this bit. Maybe a touch louder. I like that. Take note to the little details like that pre-snare. I think it's things like that that are so subtle, but at the same time, they add so much to that drum sound. I mean, that tiny reverse sound coming into that first snare. Just gives you that something else I really, really like. And there we go. They are the main drums for our track. It's already starting to look more like a track now. We have 4 or 5 elements in there. Some of those elements have multiple layers. And now that we've color coded it and start to actually lay things out in our arrangement, it's just starting to look more like a thing now, which is pretty cool. Not to mention it's starting to sound quite nice. In the next video, we're going to have a look at creating the vocal synth sound. So we do some cool things with vocals basically to create a synth-like effect. It's pretty interesting stuff and pretty different, using some nice ideas. I've been Multiplier. Hope you enjoyed.